All right, welcome everyone to Growing Up in Science and the Global Online Edition. My name is Wei Ji Ma. I'm the founder and organizer of the series. I know that there's always some new people, so I'll just briefly say what this series is about. Essentially, this series is about listening to each other's stories. Right? Every scientist has their own unique story, and we rarely get to hear about it. We might hear sort of like a polished version of it in bios or in talk introductions, but there's usually a lot more going on behind the scenes, and it's important to talk about those things because they also involve setbacks and struggles and obstacles that people's environments impose upon them. So the series has been about candor, like candidly speakers candidly telling their life stories, their career stories, and also about like a sense of belonging, right? Creating a sense of belonging where trainees realize that in spite of difficulties, there are still a variety of paths that lead to what's considered success in science, and that definitely not all the established professors had a very smooth career trajectory. So today I'm really thrilled to have Deepy Murty as our guest. Deepy is an associate professor in psychology and neuroscience at Temple University, and Deepy came very strongly recommended by more than one person who thought that Deepy had a very interesting life story, and I've since learned that that's definitely the case. Maybe you already had a chance to read his unofficial story. But anyway, welcome, Deepy, and we are very much looking forward to hearing from you. A few logistics. First of all, since this is an extremely informal setting, it would be lovely to see people's faces if they feel comfortable. So if you wanted to turn on your camera, we would appreciate it. Of course, no obligation. And second, Deepy is welcoming questions during his talk, so you can just type those into the chat or raise your virtual hand, and we'll get to you. Thanks, and Deepy, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much, Wei Ji, not just for inviting me, which is like the least important thing you've done in this space, but more so for just, getting this from the start. We've done it at Temple a couple times, and it's been really helpful, which puts on a high sense of pressure for me. And I was thinking about it a lot today of like, what's the balance between like not trying to sound like an Instagram influencer, but then also be like a genuine human. So I think I'm going to land somewhere in between the two of it. And I thought a lot of these sort of take on a failure narrative, but I really, sort of the balance between failure and perceived success. But I really want to focus on my narrative being like a hot mess narrative, right? Because I think another thing we walk away with when we look at professors is like, oh, wow, like they've got their shit together. And that is like the antithesis of my being in this space. And it's like just a constant round of adjustment and readjustment and pivots and more adjustments and readjustment that I think sort of defines it. So I'll sort of launch into my narrative of adjustments and balance and sort of take that as a starting off point. But like a lot of 40-somethings who grew up with two Indian parents that were both doctors, like my love for science immediately got transformed into becoming a doctor, right? It's sort of like, if you have A, this is what you do with it, which is B. So I went into undergrad being like, this is it. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to do it. I love science. And I think it was my second year that I failed organic chemistry 2, which is like a mandatory requirement for pre-med. I immediately went home and like slept for 12 hours because that's the only emotion regulation techniques I had available for me at that time. And I had this big sense of like dread of like, oh my God, I have to take this class again. And it was a lot of resistance towards it. And then that following summer, I took an EMT class just to be like, okay, is this what I want to be doing? Like, let me see if I want to be in this space. And I took it, it was literally 3 weeks after my EMT acceptance came in that my sister started choking on an ice cube, and I ran away and got my mom, right? So it was like multiple flags were coming up that was like, ooh, I don't think medicine's the way to go. But ultimately it took this like, what I thought was the biggest deal ever in my life, failing a class, to be like, hey, what do you want? Like, what are you moving to? What do you want? So then eventually undergrad landed.
How did your parents take that?
Okay, so they're pretty, I almost feel like I was a tease for them because I was still studying neuroscience, right? But knew I didn't want to be an MD. And eventually I obviously landed on like getting my PhD. And I swear they made up a fake cousin who got his PhD in neuroscience and then decided to go back to med school and had me like talk to this guy I'd never heard of before, right? Like he like came crawling out of the woodwork to try to convince me the other path. So, but they eventually got on board because they've been pretty supportive through the whole spot. But again, just like me, they just like didn't know what the space was, right? And had this sort of this vision of what it was supposed to be. So then I was like, okay, I don't want to be an MD, and I don't know, and I hate this side of me in the moment of when I was like 21, was that like my body knew it wanted to study psychology, right? Like I knew that's what I was interested in, but like somehow it felt like it was too soft of a science or something. There's this tension between like, oh no, I'm a hard science guy, right? Like I need to prove my worth with a hard science field. So I went into a PhD program at Duke where you can actually pick your own like where you wanted to specialize, like what department in your second year, because I like in that moment still felt the tension. Like I felt the tension between the two. The tension got reinforced even more because I was working at the NIH at the time, and you could see all these psychiatrists that would sit at the big table, and then all the psychologists would be on the outside table, right? Like this hierarchy was getting like reinforced in really weird ways. So despite being in grad school, knowing that human behavior and like cognitive neuroscience too, but like human behavior was my main drive, I still decided to get my PhD in neurobiology. Like, which makes no, like, it was the doubt machine was like, oh, if I, and I look back at myself then I'm like, what a bozo mistake, and like what a way to like fall into the false narrative of who. Like, I don't even know whose false narrative it is, but I fell into this false narrative. So while I was doing neurobio, I was still studying psychology the whole time in my PhD, and knew this is what I wanted to do. So I went to do a postdoc with Leila Davachi to just dive deeper into imaging methods and more psychology. It was like the most bizarre experience in the world to be simultaneously so happy on some dimensions of my life and then like so miserable contemporaneously at the same time. Because on the upsides, like Layla's amazing. The postdoc environment at NYU was like the best at that time. There was like 12 of us that were all, I just saw Lauren Alice pop in, I think. There was like 12 of us that were like all studying the same thing, sort of roughly. And it was just like this really fruitful environment. So like from an intellectual standpoint, I was like thriving so much. But then it was like postdoc's the first place where you don't have this built-in sense of community in some ways, but I still had it, but it just felt different. Or maybe it was like, oh, I'm approaching my 30s and now I'm old. Like, what's my life gonna be? So I was like simultaneously having this like precocious midlife crisis about what I'm doing with my life. On the personal dimension stuff, I'm feeling like unbelievably lonely in some of those domains, despite being surrounded by friends. But then at work, I was like, oh my God, I love this so much. This is really great. And in grad school, I sort of just took a pass. I was like, I'm going to ignore my personal life. I used to do this horrible thing that I would like work till 7, go home, eat dinner, then go back to lab and then meet friends out at 10 p.m. Right? Like, and this was every day of my life. Like I just wouldn't sit alone with my thoughts. And now I was like living by myself in New York. So, I would have this like intermixing, confusing waves of like depressive episodes, but then also being like, I can't believe I'm surrounded by so much friendship and such great science. And then it would teeter back and forth. And then all of my like really close friends were all my postdoc friends and my grad school lab mates. So then the first like year and a half of it was solidly good, but then like the approaching deadline of faculty job market like rears its head through the space. And for as much as I loved the postdoc community at NYU, like talk about a contagion for social anxiety to just like incubate and it like take up the entire space. There was like
yeah.
8 of us on the job market at the same time. So one person would get a piece of news and you could just like literally like see the anxiety spread. Like
so in this period of time, or maybe even a little bit before that, did you get have access to professional support or like friends and family or?
yeah. So what would happen, and this is just I thought I was the most happy person in the world on some dimensions, right? If people have met me, I'm like ear to ear smiles, like bordering on being a clown, right? And I was like, oh, this is the right me, right? Like, I love my job. I love this. I'll make this work. I have so many friends. And then sort of, I would have like, 9 months of feeling great and then have like a huge episode of depression for 2 months. Then the scientist in me would be like, oh, well, of course, the preceding cause of this depressive episode was this event happening. So, I don't suffer from MDD. I am reacting to this situational mood, and those started to ramp up at the end of grad school. And in postdoc, I was like, okay, this is getting a little bit more real. So what I would do in this time would be like, try to find a therapist, not really be able to afford it because I was a postdoc in New York. And then I was like, okay, cool. I'll take drugs, like antidepressants, and then I'd feel better for 3 months. And I was like, okay, well, I don't need it anymore. So then I would stop, jump forward 16 months later, and I was in the exact same like looping cycle again. So it was like a pretty continuous loop. And I look back on it and I think so much about like these were the closest friends of my life in some ways, because we were going through this like really shaky thing and everybody was so vulnerable and supportive, right? So like professional support was sort of lower than other periods of my life, but like peer support was awesome and probably like the only thing that sort of sustained me through those moments. Also in the end of grad school and the beginning of postdoc was like my coming out as gay journey was sort of intermittently happening in there, and people were like, oh my god, you came out, that's a huge deal. And I'd be like, I guess, or like wasn't really that big of a deal, like I just kept on telling my narrative that everything was okay, right? It was actually really interesting to sit down and think about my narrative through this space, because it's like, oh, this is not the narrative I told myself, right? Like, let me step outside of myself to write this narrative, because it was so much more denial was embedded in the narrative I was telling myself. And give me and my therapist another 2 years and we can try to figure out where that is coming from. But
like, so the coming out part, was it, to what extent did it cause you emotions that you were able to process only much later?
Yeah, this is interesting, Wei Ji, is like, if you're feeling an emotion in real time but don't realize it, did it actually exist or not? So if you ask me, like, how much did coming out influence my grad school life or my postdoc life, right? I think I would honestly have told myself that the answer was like not at all, like 0, right? I think the way I was conceptualizing in my head is like, okay, this is, I was more preoccupied with being Indian and like the community not accepting. So I came out to friends and coworkers many years before I came out to my parents, right? So there's a big window there. And I think I set up this thing where I was like, okay, academia is the safest space in my life right now to come out, right? Like, where are you going to get a like larger group of liberals hanging out in one spot, right? Like, it's a really easy place to come out. Even despite that, it still took me a while. I'm not judging myself, but I did at the time. But then I was like, okay, it's not affecting my work at all. And it wasn't until sort of like jump forward 6 years where I started doing a lot of diversity work as a faculty member here that I sort of had to take the perspective of students that were probably being more vulnerable with themselves, that were going through the same thing, that I had to then sort of like recast what I was feeling in those moments, right? Like how much effort was I putting into downplaying my sexual orientation, and that wasn't othering, to like maintain a sense of like, everything's normal. And I think, in my hindsight, like, yeah, nothing was super overt, right? And like, thank, I don't want to say thank God, because that's the thank something, right? Thank higher order stuff, that nothing was in that domain of overt, but I think I never really had access to like how just like subversively fatiguing it was. And even if it wasn't happening at work, even the part where it was affecting like, what do I do in my life about this, like,
Yeah.
is going to change your landscape in relationship to work. Because, you know, not a popular opinion to share, but something that I still abide by. Like, I love Twitter telling us that we should have work-life balance, but it just seems like complete bullshit to me, right? Like the nature of this job does not promote work-life balance. Like when your friends are coworkers and when studies come to the top of your head before you go to bed, like you can't turn it off, right? Or I couldn't turn it off. It's just like not in my MO. So, given that like porous boundary between the two spaces, it just, I don't know. Like I'm still trying to figure out what the role of it is, because it's not this like blatant sledgehammer role, but you can feel it a little bit, and it becomes weird. You feel it. I feel it more when I'm like, somebody in Philly started like a queer professor happy hour group, and I'll go to it and I'm like, oh, like I feel some sort of like something, somebody should ask a question about that, because I don't have the words for what that something is. And now I'm going to pull back this tangent just to get through time, and then sort of hit all these other tangents. Again, the theme was hot mess, so I'm just re-edifying the we're not going to do full temporal order here. So, okay. Life was hard, blah, blah, blah. Postdoc was wonderful scientifically. Job market happened. I felt like embarrassingly confident in some dimensions. Like I was like, I'm fit for a job. Like I deserve this. Again, not another popular opinion that you're allowed to feel that way, but then also like immensely insecure that it wasn't going to happen and my life was going to be over, right? So like imposter syndrome is not the right word for it, because I didn't feel like imposter. It was like more just like a hopelessness syndrome, right? That it was, I just didn't think it was going to be happening. But I think what made it sting more was like, wait, I love this, and I like actually believe I'm good at it, and that doesn't matter, right? And somebody needs to make up a word for that, because that's sort of like what defined the space. So I had a bunch of interviews, fell in love with each job, got an interview in the like dream city I wanted to be in, which was Pittsburgh. And then I was second on a list, and I got strung along for 6 months with like a high propensity thinking I was going to get this job. Right, because they kept on saying like, "Oh, this person's not getting it. If that doesn't happen, then well, you're in it." And I knew that person was going to turn down the job, so I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is going to happen! Like, I'm going to get the job in the city I want to be in." And then it ended up not happening, because this is how things work in academia a lot of the times. And then I was like, "F this! I can't do it anymore. I can't be in New York. I can't continue to go on the job market. Like, I'm over it. I'm just sort of going to succumb." And I knew I still wanted to do research, but like I knew I love psychology. I knew I love a sense of community. So then I was able to get a junior non-tenure track faculty position at Pitt Psychiatry, which I understand for some people is like a dream, right? Like it's one of the best psychiatry departments in the country. It's like a dream job that has launched so many careers, but I just like did not care about clinical research through that lens, right? Like I care about clinical stuff now a lot, and I'm interested in it, but it just like wasn't the orientation, was like pretty fundamentally disaligned with the psychiatry department. And I was really trying to make it work. I was like back in Pittsburgh where my family was, and I was like, I'll take this and that and I'll add my flavor to it. And like, again, trying to convince myself everything is going great. And then I was treating it like a 9 to 5. I like went home at 5 and didn't think about work. And for some people are like, oh my gosh, that's great. And I was like, this is the worst, right? Like this thing that I love is gone from me. You know, I started to foster a lot of other stuff in my life, which was really good. Like that's when I actually started like dating and like making friends that weren't affective or memory neuroscientists and like, you know, exploring hobbies and doing all this stuff, which, you know, again, was like really rewarding on that domain, right? Like the other side of your life. But then I just like, what happened to the thing that I love? Like a great example of it is like, because if I was somebody else in that position at Pitt, I would be in the most wonderful position in the world, but I had no ability to do memory research, right? Like I had to pivot to other things. So the thing that I loved the most was suddenly just like not in my arm's reach in any way. And then I got sort of like, this was like a weird, this was probably the first place where I started to feel like an imposter too, because I would like go hang out with all of my cognitive friends and everybody's like, oh my God, congratulations, you're a professor. And like, and I was like, yeah, I guess, like sort of, right? Because I was like, in some ways, I was doing research that I loved so much more in postdoc and had more independence there than this faculty position that I was like starting to feel like a fraud in those domains. But the fraudiness was sort of like, oh, my friends are viewing me as doing something more important than I really am. So I felt like very disingenuous. And then it was secondhand to that I was like, oh, maybe I need more than this, right? Like I don't want to feel, it's like I waited till I was 39 to feel othered. No, like 37 or 36 to feel othered from my peers. So it was a really confusing time. So then I was like, okay, I'm just going to go on the job market again. And also because it was a soft money position, it was like, if you don't get a grant in the soft money position, it might not exist, right? So I went on the market again and then got an offer from Temple, which I loved, you know, add one more depression episode to the tally because I had to move away to Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. And then, you know, cruising from there, it's been really great. Like I love it. And I'm doing all the science that I love so much. And I was like, given the greatest gift that my department is full of like some of the most supportive individuals in the world that are both my peers and mentors. So again, like the whole landscape is driven. I love working with students. Like I love the research we're doing. It's sort of, you know, feels right on a lot of dimensions, like talking to people, grad students and trainees about like, oh, do I stay in academia or do I leave? And it's like, I get why I love it. I get that a lot of people don't love what I love. And I would just feel really like, not to sound like smug, but I was like, oh, yes, I love what I'm doing, right? Like, not smug, like, not to be like, oh, cool, I figured it out, you know? Because as much as I felt so solid that I figured it out and I was in the right spot and I was like studying the stuff I love, you know, then comes like the whole other waves of stressors that like invite into the space, which aren't the stressors that I experienced before. Part of this is like I also in that time like met a romantic partner who will likely be my partner for a very long period in my life, if not forever. And then I was like, oh no, I love him and I love work. And sometimes I want to be at work and just sort of like ignore him because I did that for 35 years. But like, I now care about him. So what do I do? Like the stuff that I didn't think about, or this part where you like know you've made a trainee cry, like you know they're gonna leave your office and cry because something hard had to happen. And then I'm like, okay, don't ruminate on this for the next 3 days, right? Like you handled it the way that you could, but I was like, oh my God, now I'm the person that is like invoking the sense of tears, right? So it's not like everything's like blissful and wonderful, like the same tensions there, but at least there's like some sense of grounded stability, you would think, right? Until this like last year, I just went on the job market again, just to like nose around for other positions. And I was like, oh, you were just hiding insecurity. Like you were still in there. I just like didn't I like buried you enough under things. And here again, and I'm not like I'm very proud of all the accomplishments I've done. And like objectively in this state of my career, I can look at my CV and be like, dude, you're doing solid, like you're doing good work and solid. And then you still get rejected from jobs and like can feel like a total piece of shit at the same time, which I'm just sharing this here now to be like, it's not real. Like that feeling of feeling like a piece of shit is like not a tangible objective marker. Like I was literally went on the market because one of my colleagues said, Deepy, your CV's never gonna look better than it does right now. Like you've had a year where you're on fire. Like this is the time to go on the market. And you would think that I'd be like, oh, I'm coming from a sense of strength and confidence and self-efficacy, and that's just like all destroyed by going on 2 interviews. You know, like it's a weird balance. Like I was pretty confused that all these like, you know, I was totally regressing back to 2015. And I thought I was like really far away from it, which is like, I mean, I don't know what to do with that. It exists. But that gets us to right now.
So just clarification, is this the feelings that you have when you went to interviews, was it sort of mostly like attacks on your self-esteem, or is it that you're not quite sure whether you fit in the culture, or some combination of those things?
Oh, I wish it was like stuff about like not fitting in the culture. It was like literally all of a sudden I have stopped doing horizontal comparisons with my peers, and then putting yourself in a situation that you are doing horizontal comparisons with your peers, you can just re-invoke a sense of being like, I'm not good enough again. Again, not an imposter syndrome per se, because I still feel like I belong. It's this like just not good enough. Like I belong, but I'm just not good enough for other people to acknowledge that I should belong, right? Which is like a weird balance of like confidence wrapped in about 10 layers of insecurity, right? Like, oh, I bet if I did computational modeling, then I would have been a better candidate, right? Or like, oh, you know, I care more about behavior, but like, you know, the people schools want do methods, right? Like all these things that I don't fundamentally believe them about myself, which I get can sound really obnoxious, right? Like I get that the confidence in this arena can come across as obnoxious, but like I will you to know me to know that I like the insecurity outweighs this weird hidden sense of confidence that is like somewhere else, right? And now I'm like, it's been an interesting experiment because this has been all in the past year, and I'm like, I'm really trying to figure out like, oh, where did this come from, right? Like, what does this mean about my sense of self that I can still get like triggered by peer related stuff? But that's like currently in the scope of me like working my way through it. Okay, so I tried to, despite it not being fast, I tried to zip through that as fast as I can, because I do think like questions are a better way to sort of actually get like
Sure, yeah,
real vulnerability in depth. If people have questions, if not, I can just continue to ramble.
no, absolutely. So maybe it's a good moment to pause, see if people have any questions about your story so far. So oh yeah, I see one question. Let's take that one first, Camille. I don't hear you right now. Yeah. You should be able to unmute yourself. I think I set that setting, yeah. And
oh, she says you
oh,
can't.
sorry. Okay, sorry. Let's try again. Yeah.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, great. Hi. Thanks, Deepy, so much for sharing your story so far. I had a question about something that came up like pretty early in your sort of description of your career trajectory. And I was wondering, how do you reconcile, like, if what you're really caring about in the moment is like human behavior in a psychology department, but it seems like grants, journals, future jobs, all of these things are like really, and just like peer pressure and whatever, are really encouraging you to use alternative methods, but you're like, I think the thing that my question needs at this moment is this like clean behavioral study. Like, how do you reconcile those things? Like, do you throw in fancy methods so that like you sort of play the game? Or like, I guess that's where I'm like struggling right
Yeah,
now with like what my interests are versus like what I feel like everyone else wants my interests to be.
right. So barring that one move to psychiatry where I felt like I didn't, it was the option on the table that was there. This job is hard and encompassing and really challenging on a billion dimensions. The payoff for it is that like I have the gift of following the fun. Like that's what academia brings to the table, right? So I will not fully play, I will never fully play the game, right? Like I'm gonna follow the fun first, because that's why I'm here. If it's not that, and I think this is what was happening when I was sort of over in a psychiatry department that was much more about methods and like biotyping and identifying and predicting, which just weren't my questions. It wasn't fun anymore, right? Like, and that's the part that I wanted to put at the very utmost. Now, obviously you like have to play the game a little bit, but for what that means for me is to either keep looking till you find a way that you can make that fun, like find the right way to ask the question or the set of techniques that gets you there. Or it's like aim 3 of your 3 aim grant, right? Like you do you for 65% or 70% of it and then do what you need to do for the last 30%. But I'll never let strategy overtake the like core interest, or else like what's like that's our only win in this field, right? So I'm just like always going to prioritize that. Now, like I've been lucky to be able to do that. And then sometimes if you're like, you know, really thirsty for grant funding, you might not have that opportunity for it. But I even serving on grant reviewing panels, like people get excited about enthusiasm and it's really hard to fake, right? Like it's hard to fake that. So I still say like you got to foster that sense of like I want to be here for it, or else you'll burn out immediately too.
Thanks.
Yeah, I want to second that. Just if I can interject on personal note, I also was at various points sort of strongly encouraged to either do fMRI or maybe clinical work, or maybe work more with neurobiologists. And I was just happy doing my behavioral modeling and human experiments, and I resisted probably too stubbornly those encouragements. And I'm happy that I did. And I think at some point, if you continue in academia, you will also be in a position to change the norm of the field so that like your methods are more appreciated for what they can do. Sorry, didn't mean to hijack the conversation.
Yeah. And then just get comfortable with being in lower impact journals for a while and like live with it. Because you're having fun, and that's more important. Ooh, I'm turning into an influencer. You see it, the fears are coming true.
So, there's another question. Mega, do you want to ask your question by voice, or shall I read it? Okay, maybe I'll read it. Hey Deepy, thank you so much for being here. How do you manage the balance between maintaining a healthy mental space and the type of productivity academia demands?
Okay, now I'm going to answer this I-centrically, right? Like, what do I do? And the answer is like, fail at this. Like, not necessarily fail at it, but like fail at it a little bit. So, and it gets more confounded because a lot of the stuff that academia demands, I love it. Like I really love it. Like I annoyingly love the job. So what happens is I'm better at achieving a little bit more balance where I don't get to points of like, you know, ignoring when I'm in a bad way to the point that it just like spills over and destroys everything. But like I often find work to be respite from some of the challenges and stuff. Like, I throw myself into the work that I love, part of it, right? Rather than the stuff that I don't love. So I think that's one layer of it, is sort of prioritizing the time to make sure you're still doing enough of the stuff that like brings you a sense of joy. The other thing I do is just like complain a lot to my friends, which doesn't really do that good too, but it vents out some of the space. But I think like more importantly is like, I don't think that mental space, and I don't think time's the right factor to think about necessarily, like as much of it is just sort of like figuring out what you need to prioritize when and for what. So I think like the biggest thing I do is like when I'm in a way with work, I go home and be like, Mark, who's my partner, I'm about to be absent for 3 weeks, right? Like, but I promise you, like when I don't have to fully invest in work stuff, I'm gonna be prioritizing our dog, and then him like right below the dog, right? That'll be the functional order. But I think it's just about like, in a micro space, I try to find like what is going to serve my needs at this moment. And then when it gets to the point where it is really bad, I stop, right? Like, and I just had this realization 6 months ago. My therapist would always say, like, oh, Deepu, like, you're really stressed out. Be kind to yourself. And I wanted to be like, go F yourself. That means nothing. Like, get out of here, right? Like, I literally, like, I'm so tired of therapists telling me to go be kind to myself because, like, I don't know what it means. And then I finally figured out he means, like, be kind enough to let other people down, right? And that it's not letting them down, meaning say, like, no, like, I can't do this right now. Which Susan has been a recipient of this before, where she's asked me for help, and I'm like, I'm not, it's call me in 2 weeks. But I think this is what they mean by being kind to yourself.
A question from Ruth in Lawrence Lab. Hi Deepu, how have you been able to maintain your friendships post-moving?
Okay, I feel like Lauren made Ruth say this because Lauren and I have not caught up in a really long time, and we've both been doing like a pretty shitty job keeping up with each other. Just of recent,
Lauren
we do
is
a really good
denying this.
job, typically. Okay, I do a couple things. One is that I just collaborate with my friends a ton because it's like fun, and it's a good way to like keep in regular basis. We also do we're pretty good at doing like meetups at every conference that somebody is at. And then I just am incessantly on the phone, so I just call them enough. But to be truthful, it's easier to keep in touch with the friends after you leave that are doing similar things to you, because I'll see them at the same conferences, and it's been like harder for me to keep in touch with my friends that left for industry or sort of pivoted to a slightly different field. But part of the nice parts about academia is that it's like built in a lot of regards. But I just do a lot of phone calls, like a lot of phone calls.
Susan.
Sorry. Hi, Deepu. It's good to see you. So I wanted to ask you, I had to come in late from another meeting, so sorry if you discussed this at all, but just being in my postdoc and getting to mentor more students now and thinking about moving on to potentially being a PI and kind of being like the last person. I think I find myself with this crippling fear of not having like anyone like checking over my work. Like I'm the person that has to decide when like a grant is ready, that the analysis has been conducted correctly, like et cetera. So I guess, how do you deal with that on like an emotional level and then also like practically?
I think you're fundamentally wrong on your assumption, Susan, and it doesn't need like you never have to be the last person on it. I'm never the last person on a chain unless I feel comfortable for it. So, you have the people that you swap grants with, or even just swap. I mean, I think before, Nora Newcomb is a senior mentor in my department that I was very intimidated by when I first started at Temple, despite her being like lovely and supportive and wonderful. But I would have like my grad school friends read emails I was going to write before I would send them to Nora, right? Like
That's amazing.
Like that cohort effect is still there as long as
Yeah.
you want it. You have to find the right people. You also have to be vulnerable. Like, I had to be like, hey, Johanna, I'm really insecure about these specific aims. Can
Yeah.
you look at them now? Are those all of my specific aims? No, right? Like it's
Right.
it tailors off when you need it for where, when it like starts to feel more norm. But I think the amount of peer mentorship and then even also senior junior mentorship
Yeah.
is still really present. And if you're not at a department that is fostering that, like I would highlight that as like a pretty problematic department. And it also doesn't need to be in your department. So you just like literally bother your grad school and postdoc friends forever.
Okay,
Which
sure.
I
Yeah.
guess
So it's
leads
more like
back
reaching out to
Reed's question,
peers.
is that
Yeah.
the other reason I'm calling friends all the time is because I'm asking them for favors constantly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Another question from Lawrence.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Deepu. I'm Kai. I'm a postback in Lauren's lab. I was wondering, I think you were talking about like essentially like loving your job a lot and spending a lot of time with it. I think one thing that I sometimes worry about is that if I do spend too much time doing something that I like thought I loved or loved in a job, that I'll end up kind of losing love for that. And because it is inherently a job at the end of the day. And I was wondering how you kind of deal with that and avoid that.
Yeah. So again, I think this is from like really poor attachment theory. I mean, the fact that I'm bringing up attachment theory when I'm talking about work and not my mother is like, gives you a sense of how problematic this is for me. So at least for me, the idea at the end of the day, it's my job, just never resonated with me, right? Like there is so much of myself that's like invested in this stupid career. And not even just like the career part of it, but like I love a lot of people now in this space, right? Like it can't just be a job because I like love a lot of my peers, right? Like these like long, deep relationships with. So I never really had the fear of tiring out on it because again, it just like doesn't sit in that space. Now, like there's parts of like I'll certainly tire out of writing IRBs and like submitting grants. Oh, this is a good one. Like, pre-tenure, I was like a grant machine. I was like writing grants every like too much. And then I had a couple land and I was like, I'm on a break and I haven't been able to start again. Like I'm on this like, I'm like, I think I fatigued out of grant writing and trying to figure out ways to like re-inspire that. Now, I just have to highlight this is me with boundary issues. You got to ask somebody else for somebody that has better boundaries on how they balance it. Because like, they're just like, there literally is no balance. And that I'm jokingly saying that like a bad thing. So I want to seriously say, I find that to be of value, right? You hear no boundaries that it's like, oh, that means work infiltrates your life on every dimension. But I also see it as like life has infiltrated work on every dimension, right? Like I sometimes feel like a fifth of my job is just like hanging out with my friends while doing work to the demise of their productivity. People have a very hard time sharing an office with me, as Lauren can attest to, because I talk a lot. But yeah. So I don't know. I sort of can't answer your question because like the orientation towards it like doesn't sort of fit the mold.
So Kai, the one thing that you sometimes also see is that as you grow more senior in academia, then at some point you have so many extraneous responsibilities that you actually long for this quiet moment when you can actually do some coding or so analyze some data or actually write a paper. So sort of the core of your work actually becomes inadvertently less and less in many people, at least, which means that you'll actually love it more, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, my job is 10 times more variable today than it was 10 years ago.
That could be fun too in itself. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So Deepy, you've been extraordinarily open about your insecurities and about your mental health struggles, and that's obviously perfect for growing up in science. But I can also see that this is not always the norm in academia. Have you encountered that?
Okay, this is really, okay, I'm gonna share something that I think was like really challenged my notion of it, right? So I feel privileged that my mental health struggles are ones that are deemed all right by academia, right? Like generalized anxiety and depression are like, you know, a drop in the bucket. One out of every one academic probably has like had some combination of these mixtures. But I remember this, and like, you know, vulnerability is hard. I'm going to be vulnerable about this because I'm struggling with it, but I'm working my way through it. Is that there was a time when I had a really bad episode of depression right when I started, and I had to take a month leave, right? Because I was like waiting for medications to kick in. And I went to take a month leave, and I was supposed to present at this conference with one of my senior colleagues. And I was like, hey, mental health stuff, can't make it, this, and this, like, especially traveling because I wasn't sleeping well. I was like, circadian rhythms are gonna, like, I just can't do it. And then I could tell that that colleague thought I had a bipolar diagnosis. And now I would never have judgment about somebody having a bipolar diagnosis. The amount of paranoia and fear that I had that it would get out to my colleagues that I had a bipolar diagnosis was causing me so much anxiety about it that I had to be like, no, listen to me. Let me tell you very clearly what my diagnosis is, right? And then I'm just like, I hate myself that I felt the need to clarify it. Like, I hate society that they've somehow have like, you know, disability spaces that are okay and disability spaces that aren't okay. And that I like, you know, I sort of weirdly believe that it is a privilege that I walk around with a mental health space that is like deemed societally okay. So I almost feel like a fraud sometimes when I'm like very, very vulnerable about it. Cause it's like, you know, all things considered, this is a very easy. No, I'm not saying it's easy because I'm sure people are suffering with this a lot. On the relative scale of all the things that there are to disclose, I am on an easier side of the spectrum of mental health. And I wonder if I would have that strength if I was like in a space that it is these sort of families of disorders that aren't considered okay. And like, and the idea that some disorders aren't considered okay when we're like psychologists, like makes my head want to explode. And like, I don't know what to do about it. Because I've had students ask me whether they should disclose stuff, and I have to be like, you know what, it matters what it is. Like, you know, it's actually not safe right now, like gestalt to disclose stuff. I think the call to action is that more tenured faculty members that have stuff that are on this other domain, like I think it's their responsibility to start disclosing more while they're in a safe position. So you know what I mean? Like I'm like, would you like, it's been fine for me. If anything, and this is what makes me feel shittier about it, like people applaud me for it. Like, oh, thank you for being brave enough to share. And I'm like, oh, I hate myself. I mean, I still think it's really important to share this stuff because like a lot of people don't share like disability space related things in public forums. But I'm also just like, you know, it's hard, right? Like it's I as you can tell by my answer not being cogent, it's like
Yeah, but you're
complicated.
also moving the bar, right? You're by being very vulnerable about your condition, you are making it easier for everybody who has mental health struggles to be.
I mean, I think that's the hope, right? Like, I think the hope is that the bar starts to incrementally move, and there's like a lot of room for movement in it, but I still have like a lot of just distress about how much there isn't room. Not that I'm ever discouraging somebody to disclose, but like when trainees ask me things, I'm like, you have to know your audience, and like there's spaces of safe and unsafe disclosures still, which is rough.
Yeah. Yeah, Michael.
Hey, hey, Deepy. Hey, so I just something sort of about my own like career, but also I think it's a question that other people will be interested in too. And just like, I guess how to figure out kind of, and I know we've emailed a bit about this, but I think like how to figure out like how to hang in there. Cause I mean, I feel like the way you approach science is such an inspiration for me. And I think like, I feel kind of like you do, like, even when it feels like there's no positive feedback or not enough positive feedback coming, it's like, okay, I think I can do this. I mean, I don't know, some parts of the job of being a professor sound kind of scary, but I feel like, at least in principle, I think I can do science. And yet, for me, it's like 8.5 years out from my PhD. Like, my first postdoc wasn't productive, reasons partially my fault, partially not. My second postdoc, I think, was productive, but there's not much to show for it just yet. My third postdoc remains to be seen. Like, but it's like, so it's like I think I want to keep hanging in there as long as I can. But then I also feel like my previous postdoc mentor kind of made me feel much more depressed. But like, well, you know, maybe like just based on the fact that it's been this long since your PhD, like I don't know, maybe you shouldn't keep hanging in there. And it's like, so that kind of persistence, like at what point does it become counterproductive versus like, I mean, hanging in there as long
Yeah.
as
I think it's like what's the there is a hard question. So I was considering like when I was like, okay, this med school department's not working for me. I'm gonna go on the market, but then I also like turn the mirror to myself to be like, okay, what do I really want? Like, what am I looking for? So I was like real close to considering trying to get jobs on the creative side of marketing because I was like, this is like my overlapping feature space. Because I realized even the like title of an assistant professor at a top tier university wasn't actually like nourishing my uh sense of self or something, you know. So I think it's just sort of am I this is going to be so disappointing of an answer, Michael. Like I asked myself like, am I happy with what I'm doing right now, right? Like I try to invoke a like mindfulness moment of taking a deep breath into right now, and I get that that doesn't like that only works so far for the right now, but then at least trying to like figure out what it is, because like I've had friends with really long non-tenure track careers then transition into tenure track spaces, and I mean like really long, right? Like, but I think for some of them it was a mistake because they were fundamentally unhappy in that space in between, and then for some of them it was the right move because it like got them in the right space. And I think that's how I've always sort of like tried to breathe into it too, which is why the pit part was pretty interesting because it was sort of like, you know, I don't like, I'm not in love with this right now. So even when I was thinking about what's next, it like had a little bit more of a broader scope of what was next rather than the like professional lens forward. But I empathize quite a bit with the like self-propelling cycle machine that academia requires.
yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And yeah, I think I'm reasonably happy, like as long as I'm doing science and interesting stuff. I mean, I guess I'll keep hanging in there, but yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Like, cool, thanks.
So Deepa, I was intrigued by you're saying that you're still working through what drives you into this mode of horizontal comparisons with your peers. And are you comfortable sharing any of that, of the insights that you've developed there?
Yeah. So what is okay? So it was in no way sort of had any negative affective tone till it was put to the test of the job market. So that's life. like I'm all right. Like I'm comfortable that interviewing for jobs is going to make me insecure, right? Like that. That will always forever happen with my anxiety template. I think what has been the shift that has happened is that where in earlier parts of my career where the lateral comparisons felt like pushing me down, now the lateral comparisons is having me like sniff around with curiosity more. So we have like a colleague, Joey Dunsmore, who just somehow, I know this can't be true, but I'm convinced he works 30 hours a week. and he is like most productive monster in the world, right? And at one point the narrative was just like, oh god, Joey's doing so much better than me, and now I'm just like, how do you do this, Joey Dunsmore? like it's still from like, I want to be more like you, but like like the affective tone of it changed a little bit. And it's interesting. I've been doing some emotion regulation research with Chelsea Gillian recently that we're thinking about like role playing shifts, and I'm seeing their like general utilities. I've been thinking a lot about just sort of taking different perspectives on whatever the feeling is and seeing if I can like recast it with a different frame shift. So I don't know. They don't like, it didn't feel that way until it got put to the litmus test if somebody else got a job that I didn't, right? And then I started asking myself, what's wrong with me?
Lauren.
Sorry, I'm realizing we're at the last minute, but I guess kind of Deepu, that question that you just, or your answer just now, and just for people who don't know, Deepu and I were postdocs together at NYU. Deepu, you and I are both, or at least like pre-pandemic, I felt very confident, and for you, I still do, and for me, it might be changing a little, but like of us as extroverts. And I guess I feel like that links right up with the lateral comparison thing. And so both of us during our PhD and postdoc had really, really rich networks of friends who were also amazing scientists and have been super successful and stuff. I'm wondering what you think in yourself and others about people who are introverts and the path to science, if you're not kind of oriented the way that you or I especially are. And since you've, done a lot more mentoring, kind of, could you speak to people who maybe aren't so, able to make that kind of connection and rely on such a vast network the way that you do? Because I think that's something quite, unique about you.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting question, Lauren, because my perspective, my partner has autism, so we talk a lot about the privilege I walk around with in my extroversion, which has made me think about this a lot too, and also just thinking about how I've at times maybe erred on the side of quantity versus quality, and this dimensionality of Lauren's right. I think out of a fear of loneliness, made sure that every single person I was going to approach them as a friend in the world. It's been really wonderful. It is a really rich network. I'm not undermining that at all. I do think that some amount of like that type of space, whether it just comes from necessary peer support to sort of, I told Susan, you have to have people to send your grants to. Like, I think that that definitely has a high utility of it. I think the size of that network, you and I are probably on the like upper limits of it becoming pathological, and it doesn't need to take much, and I think it can be like a smaller space. I do think and I've been talking to my partner about this a lot, of like how the approach happens to generate that type of community is still an open model, and we've been thinking a lot actually for like grad school interventions that I would love to talk to you about, that we've been thinking about to sort of generate that sense of community, but not necessarily the way we did it, which is like going to conferences and like going to bars with friends throughout all of our 20s, right? Which might not be the like space for a full range. But this is like a diversity issue I've been like really on top of, or like not doing anything yet, but thinking about like a lot the past year.
All right. So yeah, we're sort of in the stage of wrapping up. So any concluding questions from anyone? You can raise your hand. All right. If not, then thank you so much, Deepu. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks for inviting me, Wei Ji. I really, it
Yeah.
helped me do some self-discovery too, which I always appreciate.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks everyone for attending. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.